The flames destroyed my hay barn in less than 20 minutes. The HOA president stood across the road watching it burn. She thought the fire had erased every problem she'd ever had with my farm. She had no idea the fire itself was about to become the evidence that ended her career. If you love HOA stories, HOA revenge, and unbelievable courtroom twists, subscribe now, because today's story proves that sometimes the biggest mistake isn't starting a fight, it's believing nobody can prove how it started. For 32 years, my family's hay barn had stood at the edge of our ranch. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't modern. But every winter, it protected hundreds of hay bales that kept our cattle alive through the cold months. Everyone in Cedar Ridge Estates knew that barn. Especially Karen Whitmore. For nearly 2 years, she'd complained that it ruined the neighborhood view. She wanted it painted, then moved, then demolished. Every demand received the same answer. The barn sits entirely on private agricultural property. She hated hearing those words. 3 weeks before the fire, Karen arrived with 2 HOA board members carrying violation notices. She claimed smoke from my tractors, dust from my fields, and the barn itself lowered nearby property values. I calmly refused to remove anything. She smiled before leaving. "You'll regret making this difficult." I didn't think much of it. Until 2 weeks later, just after midnight, I woke to frantic pounding on my front door. "Jacob, it's your barn." I rushed outside. Orange flames towered above the roofline. The entire hay barn was burning. Volunteer firefighters arrived within minutes. Neighbors gathered along the road. As hoses soaked the collapsing structure, I noticed Karen standing beside her SUV. She wasn't helping. She wasn't shocked. She was simply watching, almost satisfied. The fire was eventually contained before it reached nearby pasture land. By sunrise, everything inside the barn had been destroyed. Years of equipment, winter hay supplies, family records stored in an old office, gone. The county fire marshal arrived shortly afterward. He walked silently through the ashes for several minutes. Then he stopped near what used to be the barn's rear entrance. He bent down, picked up a small melted object, and quietly slipped it into an evidence bag. Without saying a word, his expression changed completely. The fire marshal didn't start asking about the flames. He started asking about Karen. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be treated like an accident. Fire Marshal Daniel Brooks spent nearly 3 hours examining the ruins. He photographed burn patterns, measured distances, marked every point where the fire had traveled. Nothing about his investigation looked routine. Finally, he walked over to me holding the small melted object he'd collected. It was the remains of an electronic timer. "This wasn't where a normal barn fire starts," he said quietly. My stomach dropped. He explained that accidental fires usually leave very different burn patterns. This one appeared to have begun near the rear service entrance before spreading rapidly through the stacked hay. Investigators soon discovered traces of an accelerant on nearby debris. The entire area was secured. No one was allowed inside. Later that afternoon, Brooks asked whether anyone had recently threatened the barn. I immediately remembered Karen's final words. "You'll regret making this difficult." I wasn't the only one. My neighbor, Bill Harris, stepped forward. He told investigators he'd seen a black SUV slowly driving near the barn shortly before midnight. The description matched Karen's vehicle, but Brooks didn't jump to conclusions. Instead, he requested nearby traffic cameras, volunteer fire dispatch recordings, and security footage from neighboring properties. 2 days later, investigators returned with another team. This time, they weren't looking at the ashes. They were following tire tracks, reviewing timestamps, and comparing digital evidence. Meanwhile, Karen appeared unusually calm. At the next HOA meeting, she told homeowners the barn fire was an unfortunate accident and suggested the land would now be much more attractive. Some residents nodded, others exchanged uneasy glances. Then Rebecca Collins, my attorney, received a call from the fire marshal. A nearby business had provided security footage from the night of the fire. The video didn't clearly show who was driving, but it captured one detail that made every investigator stop the recording. The same black SUV entered the road toward my barn and left exactly 7 minutes before the first 911 call. The license plate was still unreadable, but the vehicle had one feature. Karen's SUV didn't share with any other vehicle in Cedar Ridge. The investigators didn't identify Karen by her license plate. They identified her by something she never thought anyone would notice. Fire Marshal Brooks enlarged the security footage frame by frame. The SUV remained too far away to read the plate, but one detail stood out immediately. A custom chrome roof rack with an attached cargo carrier. Only one black SUV in Cedar Ridge had that exact setup, Karen Whitmore's. Still, Brooks refused to rely on circumstantial evidence alone. "We need facts," he said. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Karen's vehicle. Inside the cargo carrier, forensic technicians discovered tiny traces of burned hay, soot, and plant residue. Those samples were sent to the state laboratory for comparison with material collected at the fire scene. At the same time, detectives reviewed Karen's phone records. She had claimed she was asleep when the fire started, but her phone connected to a cellular tower less than 2 miles from my ranch shortly before midnight. Then, another surprise surfaced. A nearby farm supply store voluntarily provided surveillance footage from earlier that evening. Karen appeared purchasing a red gasoline container and work gloves. When questioned, she explained the fuel was for lawn equipment at the HOA clubhouse. Investigators requested the store receipt and transaction records. Everything was documented. Rebecca Collins quietly assembled every report into a growing evidence binder. But Brooks still wasn't ready to make an arrest. "There has to be one final piece," he said. That piece arrived 3 days later. The state crime lab finished testing the samples recovered from Karen's SUV. The residue was chemically consistent with debris collected at the barn fire scene. Combined with the electronic timer, burn pattern analysis, location data, witness statements, and the vehicle evidence, investigators believed they had enough to move forward. Early the next morning, several unmarked county vehicles pulled into Cedar Ridge. Neighbors stepped outside to watch. Karen opened her front door, still convinced she had done nothing wrong. Fire Marshal Brooks approached with investigators beside him. Then he calmly introduced the warrant that would change everything. Karen thought investigators were out of leads. She had no idea the final report had just landed on the fire marshal's desk. Early the next morning, several unmarked county vehicles rolled quietly into Cedar Ridge Estates. Neighbors stepped onto their porches as Fire Marshal Daniel Brooks walked toward Karen Whitmore's front door, carrying a thick evidence folder. Karen opened the door with a confident smile. "I already answered your questions." Brooks remained calm. "We have a few new ones." He presented a search warrant authorizing investigators to seize additional electronic devices, financial records, and maintenance logs connected to the HOA. Karen's expression immediately changed. Inside the home, forensic investigators carefully documented every item before collecting a laptop, a tablet, and several external storage drives. Meanwhile, digital analysts discovered deleted emails discussing repeated complaints about my hay barn and messages sent just days before the fire describing it as the final obstacle to the HOA's expansion plans. Rebecca Collins received copies through discovery. Each new document strengthened the timeline. Then came the biggest surprise. A forensic examination of Karen's phone revealed location history, placing her vehicle near my ranch only minutes before the fire was first reported. Combined with surveillance footage, laboratory results, witness statements, and the recovered electronic timer, investigators believed they had established a complete chain of evidence. That afternoon, Fire Marshal Brooks met with the county prosecutor. After reviewing every report, every photograph, and every forensic finding, the prosecutor quietly signed the final authorization. Brooks closed the evidence folder and nodded. "It's time." As the sun began to rise the following morning, investigators returned to Cedar Ridge. Karen stepped outside expecting another interview. Instead, Brooks unfolded an official warrant. The words he spoke next left the entire neighborhood frozen in silence. Karen expected to go back inside her house. Instead, she watched investigators walk toward her with an arrest warrant. The neighbors who once applauded her every decision stood silently across the street. Fire Marshal Brooks stopped a few feet from Karen and handed the warrant to a deputy. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said calmly, "you are under arrest based on the evidence gathered during this investigation." Karen shook her head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove I started that fire." Brooks didn't argue. He simply summarized the evidence already documented: the burn pattern analysis, the electronic timer recovered from the barn, laboratory testing, surveillance footage, witness statements, and verified location records. Karen looked toward the remaining HOA board members for support. None of them spoke. Several quietly stepped back. Within hours, the HOA held an emergency meeting and voted to remove her as president, pending the outcome of the criminal case. Weeks later, the courtroom was filled with firefighters, investigators, local farmers, and Cedar Ridge homeowners. One by one, experts explained how each piece of evidence fit together. No single clue told the whole story. But together, they formed a timeline the jury could clearly understand. The judge thanked the investigators for conducting a careful, evidence-based investigation and reminded everyone that decisions in court must rest on the facts presented, not rumors or assumptions. Months later, my new hay barn stood on the same foundation, built stronger and safer than before. As I watched the first truckload of fresh hay roll inside, I realized something my father had always said was true. The truth may take time to arrive, but when it does, it stands longer than any building.